Welcome to Tracing Your Family Roots. I'm Chuck Mason, and this is kind of a special show because this is the 400th show that we have done. And with me today is one of the founding members of the show, Arlene Sachs. And our guest today is Pat Stamm, who is the research trip coordinator for the National Genealogical Society. Pat comes in and visits us when she's in the area. So, first of all, Arlene, did you ever think that we would have this many shows 20 years later?
When we started, we thought maybe we could go for a year and have some shows. Of course, that was long before the internet and before we had any of that, and we made a videotape of it, and we tried to sell them through the Genealogy Society to other societies as a program. But never in a million years would we have thought we'd be here 20 years later.
Well, we'll have to make sure we both come back for 30 years. So today we're going to talk with Pat about developing a genealogical research plan for researching your family history. You know, it's very easy to go into a library and just figure, well, I'm going to go find everything. But really, to be successful, you have to plan beforehand. And we've talked in other shows about checking out the facility and knowing what they have. But Pat's going to talk to us about what you need to know before you go about your family.
I know, we were talking earlier today about some of the miscommunications that are appearing on the website. I told you about my grandmother who is 82 and has a 2-year-old son. Now, I'll be honest with you, I'm not 82 by any stretch of the imagination, but there's no way in this green earth that I want to have a child at this point. And people are just going out and doing hit or miss research versus actually going in and thinking about how to plan to do a research.
And they're also taking the hints that they find on websites and running with them. That's why my mother's family, on several sites, my mother has 5 siblings that my grandmother did not give birth to. You know, it's a person with the same name but in a different state. But I have a distant cousin who has decided, well, this is the same family, and added them to her tree.
I think that's one of these things you have on your notes for us to do today, or to talk about, and the mistakenly combining information that they just happen to find where somebody's the same name. And you've got that problem, and think about Jews, where first cousins very often have the same name because we have the naming pattern of naming after a grandparent. So you pick up, and my mother-in-law's name was Sophie. Her grandmother was Sophie, and in turn her grandmother was Sophie. And my mother-in-law had a first cousin who was named Sophie, who was born within a year of when she was born. So if somebody's looking back, it's very easy to pick up the wrong one.
And the important thing to remember is there are similar names within the family, first off. And second off, the research sources that we have today are so expanded from where they were back in the 1930s, the 1920s, the 1940s even. I have a very prominent DAR person who did the research on the family, and it was in the family history book. And so as I started to go down through it, I was told, make sure you verify each one of these steps. In doing that, it turns out that she tied on to the nephew versus the uncle. And there's nothing wrong with that. That was the availability of the sources that she had at that given moment in time, not at what I had today. So let's go in and start talking about a research plan. And we have a graphic for you guys, and it looks like, let's see the graphic. Okay, we're going to go through some of these steps. Select a family unit, review, determine the questions, select documents, research. And a lot of people think that research comes first. No, in doing a plan, you need to do some parameters and set some limits before you actually get into it. And then the analysis incorporating the information, and then finally reevaluating the plan. So let's start off by talking about a selecting a family unit. One of the things that we run into is that I love my students, and I can say this because I'm here in DC, but some of them have this grandiose plan that I am going to find all of my relatives starting in the Revolutionary War. Okay? They have missed the first step in doing a genealogy plan, and that is start with what you know and work backwards in time. Okay? You can't go back 5 generations to looking for a specific family until you select a person in a family unit. Okay? The second thing we want to do, let's go back to our plan and we'll see step number 2 is review. And when we start to review, I don't know about you all, but do you still have files?
Of course.
I end up taking my files and I lay them out on the table and I go through them piece by piece by piece to see what kind of information I really do have for that family. Now, we may find that there are certain missing pieces of information, such as a military piece, or such as a second marriage, or whatever.
And we also may, when we review it, we may look at something we've got and decide, you know, it's really not that trustworthy, or I'm really not confident that that proves what it says.
I'm going to give a talk in a few months on, there is a newspaper article from 1868 which is quoted in at least a half a dozen books, the Jewish Encyclopedia, and an author in Israel has just proved that the newspaper article was partially made up. And this has been, you know, in fact, somebody just wrote to me. She said, well, you know a lot about this person, and she was giving me all the sources, which I know are wrong because this, and that part of that is because so much more is available now.
Yeah.
This man found the records from 1712, where there is a different son that we didn't know about, who gives testimony in a court trial. He says, wait a minute, I'm descended from one, Arlene's descended from the daughter, and where are all these other people coming from? And he did a lot of research that he was able to do now that you couldn't do 150 years ago. And 150 years ago, that man said this is based on the documents by the author. Well, it might have been, but he romanticized it. So even if you find it at a lot of places, it can end up being wrong.
And one of the tips that one of my family suggested to me is that as you start to go through your files and you set up your research plan, don't always start with the first file. Select a different file each and every time, because a lot of the times, sorry to say, you're right, things can be wrong and we've got to build it again. Okay, another thing that we're going to talk about is, after the review, determine the question. Now, I think this is the most interesting thing of all as you start to determine the question. Think of a funnel, a pure, simple funnel. One of the things that we want to do is we want to start to funnel that question down into manageable parts. One of the things that I say to my students is that we are working with questions, and we may start with a very, very broad question, such as find all the Stamms in St. Louis. No, this isn't what we were looking for. We'll come back to that in a minute. Find all the Stamms in the United States, okay? And then we filter it down a little bit and we say, find Herman's place of origin. Okay, we're still filtering it down. And then the last question is the most focused, the most complex, the most complete question, and that's when did Herman marry Amelia? Okay, it's very, very focused and targeted, and that's one of the things that we want to do. Think of a big bullseye if you want to do it a different way. You start out with the whole bullseye, and then you keep moving your focus in until you get to that very, very narrow center point. That is what we end up doing.
Well, if you start with your own self, and let's say this Herman was your grandfather, I mean, aren't you almost automatically focusing in on that one rather than trying to find all the Stamms in the U.S. or something?
You should, but a lot of people get so overwhelmed or so involved with finding new relatives, and I found this one on the census, so I'm moving back a generation. Yeah. So I found this one on the census, I'm moving back a generation. We want to keep it targeted. Okay.
One of the things that I tell people is, don't start with, I want to know everything about. What do you want to know? I don't know when they were born, or I don't know where they married, or, and attack it that way, one question at a time.
And after you start to put out all of your information, that's when you can start to select a document. And we're going back to the chart. That's our first, that is number 4 on the chart. Select documents and location. Now, there are a number of really great websites out there that have a listing of various documents. I've come up with one for my own students where I have all of the census information and the land records and things like this. Thomas McGinty, who is a prominent genealogist in the Midwest, has come up with a number of them. He does a lot with Legacy Family Tree and Family Tree Magazine. And these are charts that show the various records, and you can check it off and see what there are. If you're looking for a marriage record, where would you look, Chuck?
Well, probably I would start, because of where my ancestors were, I would start with the state archives in either Pennsylvania or New Jersey, because they are the holders of those earlier records. So that's my point of contact. And unfortunately, I don't believe, I know that nothing for New Jersey is on Ancestry or a website, and I don't believe there's anything for Pennsylvania. So I'm going to be going to the state archives in Pennsylvania or New Jersey.
I think you would do that too for Europe. Also possibly write, and I've had luck even writing, this was before internet, so I know some of the stuff is on the internet now, writing to a mayor of a town, of a small town, say I'm looking for so-and-so, and I ended up getting an answer from a priest, because I said, if you can't help me, can you tell me who can? So he passed the letter on to the local priest who had the records and sent me the records.
And you bring up a very good point at that point, because if you can't find the state authorized marriage certificate, a lot of the times it may be in a church record.
And Jews were often listed under the church records, or in Europe, a municipality, if they didn't have before civil records, the whoever, Duke or whatever, wanted to know, who the residents were, and they would tell a church to keep the records for those, even those that were not members of that church. So you will often find records there.
And that goes on to the other graphic that we have about finding information. This is a little way for me to do it, and it's a easy graphic, okay? And it's, have I located the information? And if I haven't located it, such as the marriage document from the state, it would be a no. So I have to select another document, such as the church record. It's also a way for us to keep track of all of our documents as we're going through. Don't overlook keeping a research log. You know those old-fashioned research logs that we have? Go ahead.
One of the things I was talking to Chuck about before, a log is really great if you've got it in a notebook, but how are you going to look through 200 or 300 sources? I strongly suggest you put that on a spreadsheet.
Well,
Fantastic.
yeah.
Then you can sort by the date if you want, you can sort by the location, or you can sort by the person, and you can quickly find out what you already have and what you know, and then decide what you're looking
I
for.
got started in just doing it in Word. And there again, I can do the locator section. I can put a keyword in, and that will take me down in my document. So I don't have to keep scrolling down to find it. I can very easily find it.
But too many people don't keep track of it. I mean, I know my personal self that there was a book in the Delaware archives, okay, that was on the lower shelf. It was red in color, and it was right next to the door that went into the gift shop, okay? And of course, a couple years ago, I went back to find the book.
And they moved the books on you.
They moved the book. And I eventually did find, sorry.
That's okay.
I eventually did find it, but what I ended up finding is the fact that it was recovered. So it was no longer red, it was a different color entirely.
Well,
Sorry, people.
and that was how I learned why I needed a source citation. Mine was an orange book, and they moved the books around the library.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, the other thing is, we're going back to our little graphic with the arrows. We want to, if we have found our question, we want to go on and do analysis. Okay, look at the document. Don't just take the interesting pieces of information, such as the easy part. Don't just take the dates. Who were the witnesses? Mm-hmm. Okay.
Oh yes, I found that many years afterwards. I somehow was with someone, and we were looking at my great-great-grandfather's marriage certificate, and she said, "Oh, look, that's a relative of mine who signed it." So therefore, we found out that we were related because I think that was a brother of the person who got married or something like that. And anyway, yeah, the witnesses. Especially in old documents where there isn't this formal thing that you have to fill out, different witnesses
Yeah.
told you a lot.
I always tell my students, don't look at the document as a whole. Look at each space that has been filled in. Can you verify? You know, does that make sense even? Because sometimes things on documents don't make any sense at all. But can you verify each fact with other documents?
It's interesting. My students, we just finished a class, and I was showing them a document which was a death certificate. And I said something about a coroner or medical examiner's report. And they looked at me and they said, "Well, where's that on the document?" And I said, "It's right there." And when they started to look, it was in that second column where a lot of people just never go further on. And they had a medical examiner's report, which would take them into another thing. Recently, I was over in a cemetery in St. Louis, and that's where a bunch of our family is buried. And as I stood back from the tombstone that I was focusing on, I started to scan the horizon, okay, of the other tombstones around there. And I started to pick up other names that were relatives of ours that were all in that same cemetery.
I had that happen to me. I had a great uncle that my grandfather's sister specifically kills off in the family genealogy, but I could not find anything about him. I was in a cemetery taking pictures of tombstones, not the same surname, but I'm kind of looking through, this is back before digital cameras, the viewfinder to take a picture, and I see this other surname. So I took my picture of the tombstone, walked over, there he is. He died 14 years after My grandfather's sister killed him off.
Oh.
So that's why I could, and he ended up dying in West Virginia, not New Jersey. So that's why I could never find anything on him. I call that, sometimes if we will listen to the ancestors, they really want to be found, but we got to listen to what they're telling us before we're going to find them.
And you never know where the information is going to come. Okay, on Herman, he ended up marrying a second time, and he lived in St. Louis the entire life, most of his life, I should say. And he lived in the city, and the woman that he married lived in the city, but they were not in St. Louis. They were not in St. Louis County for their marriage record. So I go branching across to Illinois, thinking maybe they had gone over into Illinois. Not in Illinois. So I kept looking and looking, and I found a little notice in the newspaper that told of his wedding, okay? And where it was 3 counties down from St. Louis. And so when I started to do some investigation, it turns out that there had been a political convention that weekend, and that was the weekend that he went down there and got married down in that particular county.
My husband's grandparents too. We knew they were in St. Louis, but then they got married in some little town 50 miles outside of it or something like that. And somebody else happened to come across it and find it for us, because I would never have thought to look there.
And of course, people do that. They find an area where it's easier to get married. I have a bunch of cousins who were married from Pennsylvania, married in Elkton, Maryland, because they didn't have to get a blood test. My grandparents were married in Elkton, Maryland, because my grandmother was underage. My mother's sister was married in Elkton, Maryland, because she was underage, and my grandfather said, you can wait. They wanted to get married in March. And he said, you can wait until December when you can get married and don't need my permission.
So they got married anyway.
So those kinds of things are things we really need to explore.
Yes, and you brought up a good point about that too, because, and I kind of glossed over it with the marriage going over in Illinois. In St. Louis, in Missouri, you had to end up getting a 3-day waiting period. And so a lot of people would go over into Illinois because there was no waiting period. During the war years, 1940s and whatnot, a lot of people would go down into Arkansas, and they would get married and then have their honeymoon for 2 or 3 days before the guys had to report back to service. So you have to do some exploring to see what's going on. And that's why the analysis phase is so terribly important. The last part of it is incorporating, and we're going to go back to our research plan again. And one of the things that ends up doing is we incorporate the information that we have verified, that we analyzed, that is true and accurate. This is the hardest part of ever, because we want to incorporate everything, but it doesn't help us if it is wrong information. And we've given some stories about that already. And the last part of the plan is to re-examine the plan. It is very, very important as we sit down there. Have we done everything we need to do for this plan? As we start to go through this plan, and as we start to pull up research and select other documents, it may give us some suggestions that we hadn't even thought of.
Well, and I have a classic example. I killed off 2 second great grandparents too early, but all the documents that I had, they were in the 1870 census. My grandfather said his father was orphaned, and by 1880 he's living with an aunt and an uncle in southern New Jersey, and the family had lived in northern New Jersey. And I looked at all of the records I could, death certificates, probate, wills, guardianship records, state census for 1875. I couldn't find anything. I couldn't find a death record, but I couldn't find them anywhere else. So eventually, based on my research, I killed them off sometime between 1870 and 1875. Then down the road, I explored my great-grandmother's family and found a cemetery deed listed in the land records, contacted the cemetery, found out she didn't die for 12 years after I killed her off, and he died 11 years after. So I had to go back and re-examine things.
My husband had an old saying, okay, and I think this is the way we have to think of doing a research plan. Prior pre-planning prevents poor performance. And he would always say this to me over and over and over again. This was years before I was a genealogist. But I still think of that today, because if I go in with poor performance, I am not going to do honor to the family members that I am trying to remember.
Very good point.
You know? But anyway, hopefully this has given you some ideas about research plans.
I think it has, and
Okay.
hopefully our audience.
Well, I'll give you another example. In this old family where I said, you know, we always knew there were 2 children, and even the family records that they found, there were only like 7 of the 8 children listed. So they sort of assumed that the last person had died someplace. Much later, they found out he had converted, and of course, to the family, then it was
He
death.
was dead.
He was dead.
Yeah.
So you find things like that too, and you can't until you go round and round and round in that circle many times, and then sometimes just be lucky and find a document that tells you what it is.
Well, Pat, thank you very much for coming to visit. We always enjoy having you as guest.
Well, thank you very much, and I am so honored to be here on the 400 show.